Welcome to Around the World in 80.
All right, buckle up, because today we're hitting warp speed back to the 1980s.
Sounds fun.
Our deep dive today is on this super cool website I found called The 80s Guy. They've basically created the ultimate online time capsule for everything 80s, and I, for one, am here for it.
I've had a sneak peek, and I have to say, it's incredibly well done. Definitely more than just your average nostalgia trip.
Right. What really stood out to me was how The 80s Guy connects the dots between those huge historical events and what was happening in pop culture. It wasn't just about shoulder pads and Rubik's Cubes, although they are awesome.
True.
For instance, they highlighted the fall of the Berlin Wall in 1989. I mean, talk about a world-changing event. The Cold War basically ended right then and there. And get this.
Wow.
That same year, the World Wide Web was born.
Whoa, no way. I didn't realize they happened in the same year.
It's wild, right? Makes you think about how much the world was changing, both politically and technologically.
Absolutely. You could almost say it was like the world hitting the reset button. And you can definitely see echoes of those anxieties and that sense of like a new beginning in the music and fashion of the late 80s.
Totally. And speaking of music and fashion, the 80s Guy made me appreciate just how much MTV, which blew up earlier in the decade, changed everything about the music industry.
Oh, for sure. MTV wasn't just about the music, it was a full-blown visual revolution. Suddenly, how you looked was just as important as how you sounded. Artists were pushing boundaries with their style, and music videos became like mini-movies.
And probably not coincidentally, genres like pop and glam metal, which were all about the visuals, totally thrived during that time.
Makes sense.
And you know what else blew my mind about the 80s music scene? The 80s Guy made me realize how much musical diversity there really was.
Totally.
Yeah, it wasn't all just like synth pop and hair metal.
Right, although we love those.
Of course. But they pointed out how hip-hop and rap really came into their own in the 80s.
Yeah.
And not just as musical genres.
It was a cultural movement, really. These artists were giving a voice to communities that hadn't always been heard, reflecting on the social and political realities of the time.
Right. And it wasn't always pretty. Like, you look at that 10 Best 80s Hits list on their site.
That they have on there.
They've got Prince's Purple Rain right alongside NWA's Straight Outta Compton. It's like, talk about a contrast.
Wow, that's quite a musical education on one list, but that just shows you how much innovation was happening in music during that era.
For sure.
And, I mean, think about the impact those artists had. It's incredible. They influenced the sound of music today, but also fashion, language, even social activism.
It's amazing to me how music can reflect its time period so well and still go on to shape future generations. It's pretty powerful.
It really is.
But the 80s Guy, it's not just a music website.
Right.
They also dive into the rise of things like VCRs and cable TV.
Oh, yeah.
And I know, it might seem kind of obvious now, but back then, those were game changers.
Oh, huge. I mean, remember how we were just talking about how MTV changed how we watch music?
Yeah.
Well, VCRs did the same thing for movies.
Totally.
People had control over what they watched, when they watched it. It's easy to forget, in the age of streaming and on-demand everything, but the VCR really planted the seeds for that whole culture.
Yeah. It's wild to think that the 80s basically laid the groundwork for how we consume entertainment today. And then there's cable TV. Suddenly, you could turn on CNN and get news 24/7.
Crazy.
And ESPN for round-the-clock sports. It was a whole new world.
Talk about information overload, right? It makes you think about how that nonstop flow of news and information that started in the 80s has shaped how we see the world today.
Totally.
Like, you couldn't just wait for the evening news anymore to find out what was going on.
So true. And it makes what the 80s Guy did even cooler. They basically saw our need for someone to cut through the noise and just give us the best of the best.
Exactly.
I mean, they literally say on their site, don't have time or just not into research. That's okay, because our team has done all the grunt work for you, finding the top 80s things around the world.
Smart move, honestly. Especially these days, we're bombarded with so much information online. People are craving curated experiences.
I know, I am.
And the 80s Guy delivers. They've got 80s radio stations, workout playlists, a whole section on 80s Liverpool. It's amazing. They've got everything.
It really is impressive how the 80s Guy has managed to be so comprehensive, but also still so user-friendly.
Right.
But you know what I think is really cool? They don't just catalog everything 80s.
Yeah.
They actually raise some really interesting questions, like, do you have to have lived through the decade to really get it,
Oh, that's a good one.
to appreciate his impact, you know?
That's sure, for sure.
And they use movies as an example.
Okay.
Talk about like The Breakfast Club and Ferris Bueller's Day Off.
Classics.
Total classics. And yeah, those movies are totally products of their time. The fashion, the music, all of it screams 80s.
Big time.
But even if you didn't graduate high school in 1985, those themes of like teenage angst and rebellion and just trying to figure out who you are, those are timeless.
They really are. They speak to everyone, no matter when you grew up.
Exactly. And that's the thing about nostalgia, right?
It's that.
It's not just about wanting to go back to the past.
Right.
It's more about connecting with those universal human experiences that just make us tick.
You know, that's a really good point. I hadn't thought about it like that before.
And I think that's what makes a site like the 80s Guy so fascinating.
Totally.
It reminds us that even though the 80s might seem like this distant, neon-drenched memory,
Right.
its influence is still everywhere. In music, in technology, even in how we watch movies.
It's true. You can definitely see those threads connecting the 80s to today.
For sure. And you know what? It makes you wonder what future generations will be nostalgic for when they look back on us.
Oh, that's an interesting question. What will define our era, you know?
Totally.
Yeah.
What will they say about our music, our technology, the way we lived our lives?
Right. It really makes you think.
It really does. Well, on that note, I think we've reached the end of our excellent 80s adventure. Thanks for joining us on this deep dive into the 80s Guy.
Anytime. It was a blast from the past.